Hey Geeks, Ryan Schumacher here, and get ready to really geek. We've got a big one here right now. So geeky that I had to I'm getting warmed up, had to take the coat off. We need to focus on this one. Son of Man coming on the clouds, Daniel 7 and the second coming. This is a video in our series about the second coming. And we're looking at biblical support for the idea of the second coming, and then biblical not so support for some other things. We talked in the last video, for instance, about the lack of biblical support for the rapture. Just ain't there, folks. And if you want to understand more about that, if you haven't watched the previous video, go do so. It's important, as is the last one, on why it's important to get the second coming right. Here, on the Son of Man coming in the clouds, these are statements of Jesus in the Gospels that are thought to be him talking about his own second coming. And when I was getting ready for this week, I was not anticipating having to spend so much time on this. And it turned out this one is the one that has swallowed up most of my time, trying to get my head around. So I think actually that this is so in depth that I'm not going to be able to cover it in the Bible Geeks class. So I welcome any of you who are part of the class and decided to go and read this, listen to this to gain further understanding. Thank you for doing so. We're going to get into this one, and it's going to be really geeky. So it's good that it's in the video format. You can rewind. Let me know in the comments if there are questions that you have that I didn't answer. But we're going to go to the passages about the Son of Man coming on the clouds, Son of Man, in the Gospels, Jesus' own statements, how they relate to Daniel 7, and how they relate to the second coming. Okay, so Son of Man coming on the clouds. I'm going to try and get through this a little quickly, so forgive me if I'm blasting through, but I really want to give context here. So we find this passage in all three of the synoptics, Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 21. And just for simplicity, I'm going to use Matthew's gospel. So the prompt here begins, actually, I'm going to pull up Logos here for a second to show you. Look at all these red letters. Lots and lots of red letters here in the Bible. When does it start? What prompts this? And so Jesus is in the temple, and he's talking to the crowds and to his disciples. And we get, immediately prior to this passage, we get, woe to the scribes and Pharisees, woe to you blind guides, woe to you scribes and Pharisees, woe, 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 lots of woe. So he's going after the hypocrites, he's going after the ones in the temple. He's telling them that judgment is upon them. In the coda here is, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who have been sent to it. How often have I desired to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you are not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate, for I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. So he's just laid it all out, gone to the Pharisees, told them how bad they are. And then they're coming out of the temple. The disciples are pointing out the buildings of the temple. I'm trying to remember who it was. Was it Tom Wright who was saying that, it's like they're looking around saying, this office looks nice for me, and where am I going to be? I don't know. It's a funny image here. But Jesus says, truly I tell you, not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down. And then his disciples, and this is what prompts it. This is where to pay attention. Tell us when this will be. And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Boom. At that point, what do we see? Red letters. Lots of red letters. So that's the prompt. That's the kind of thing that we need to be looking towards and saying, what is Jesus answering in this passage? Because the Son of Man coming in the clouds is part of his answer to this. When is this going to be? And when is the this? Or what is the this? The destruction of the temple. All right. So what does he say? Well, he says people are going to be led astray by false messiahs. There's going to be wars and famine and earthquakes. It's the birth pangs of what will come. The apostles will be tortured and they'll be hated, but those who endure will be proclaimed as good news, and then the end will come. And he goes on, and he says, await the sacrilege that desolates, or the abomination under desolation. This recalls language from the book of Daniel about the erection of a statue of Zeus in the Second Temple, 168 BC, so a couple centuries earlier. But this was called a abomination, a desolating abomination. And he tells them, when that happens, don't believe the claims that people are going to make that they're the Messiah. I'm still the Messiah. That's what's implied. I'm telling you about this beforehand. He's actually staked his prophethood, his reputation, on the claim that the temple will be destroyed. And why does he say don't believe people who claim to be the Messiah? Because he says don't stand and fight. Rather, run from Jerusalem. Jerusalem is under God's judgment. A Messiah figure is going to be trying to reestablish the monarchy. Messiah figure is going to look at this and is going to try and get everybody together to throw the Romans out. They have done the terrible thing. They've gone into our temple and they've desecrated it. And we need to now fight the revolution. And Jesus is saying, I'm telling you that this is happening beforehand. Don't listen to people who say they're going to be messiahs. You need to get out of there. You need to run from Jerusalem. Don't stand and fight. And so this is interesting. If you've ever heard of people talking about the Son of Man saying is relating to the destruction of the temple, this is where they're coming from. So then it continues, and this starts to get to the relevant passage for us. Matthew 24:29, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not shed its light, the stars will fall from the sky, and the celestial powers will be shaken. So this language right here, if you just take it flat literal, and you don't see the connection, then it sounds like, the cosmos are coming to an end. Now this is Day of the Lord language. This is a quotation that you'll find in the Old Testament frequently. Isaiah 13, Joel chapter 2, Amos chapter 5. I quoted down here at least the Isaiah 13. So for the stars of the heavens and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be dark at its rising and the moon will not shed its light. And this is spoken, I believe it's to Babylon. It's in the context of the coming judgment, and speaking, I think it's bookended by an oracle against Babylon. But this is eschatological. This is the day of judgment coming. This is the language that was used in the Old Testament to talk about the day of Yahweh's judgment. And before we say, the stars will fall and, boom, and things go dark and all the scary stuff. Before we go there, I'm going to bring in Tom Wright. I thought he had a great metaphor in the New Testament of the people of God, which was, I have often pointed out to students that to describe the fall of the Berlin Wall, as one well might, as an earth-shattering event, might perhaps lead some future historian, writing in the Martian Journal of Early European Studies, to hypothesize that an earthquake had caused the collapse of the wall, leading to both sides realizing that they could live together after all. A good many readings of apocalyptic literature in our own century operate on about that level of misunderstanding. The day of the Lord language is apocalyptic. Let me repeat. The day of the Lord language is apocalyptic. It is not to be taken flat literal. You just go and look at it. It has all of the markers. It has I saw a vision. It has this very exaggerated discussion of moon turning to blood and all of this stuff, when quite clearly there will not be blood in space on the moon. That's not the point. That's not how the language was supposed to be, because we saw the examples where people had visions. Daniel 7's one of them. We're going to get into this, and it required interpretation, and when the interpretation of the vision came, it wasn't anything like what they saw. So we need to understand that with apocalyptic. We shouldn't be looking for the sun to go out. That's not the point. And it feels almost dumb to have to say that, but that is taken literally by some people. And it should not be. This is apocalyptic language. And as we continue, this is still apocalyptic language. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky. Then all the peoples of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. This is a Daniel 7 quote. He will send out his angels with a loud trumpet. They will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. So how long has he desired to gather them under their wings as a hen guards the chick, but they are not willing? Matthew 23:37. Okay, here the elect are going to be gathered from the four winds. So that's when everybody's going to be brought together. In a really important passage, and we don't have enough time to dig all the way into this, but it's really important. All this will come to pass before this generation passes away. We have to stop here and just reread it. All this will come to pass before this generation passes away. Once again, if you've heard people talk about the Son of Man sayings as being predictive of the destruction of the temple, this is what they're talking about. You have, it leads to strained exegesis if this generation, means thousands of years. All this will come to pass before thousands of years. I think that people who do that, they drop their hermeneutics. And for a while they'll say, well, we need to understand that these texts had meaning to the people they were written to. Jesus' quote ostensibly had meaning to his disciples. He was answering this question. He said the temple was going to be destroyed. They were going to say when. Or they said when. And he talked about a bunch of things that'll happen and then punctuated it with, all this will come to pass before this generation passes away. Well, how do you think they meant it? Or, they understood it. Where do you think, Peter was sitting there I think he really meant the church age. Thousands of years. Come on. It's not the way it would have been understood. It's uncomfortable to read this as purely future-oriented. There has to be some immediate fulfillment, especially in the light of the start of the discussion about the prediction of the temple being destroyed. So what I think we should do is go back to Daniel 7, and let's think of, if Jesus is quoting that, why is he bringing that into the discussion? That would have meant something to his audience. They would be very familiar with it. So I want us to go back and reread Daniel 7 and understand what that means. So, rereading Daniel 7. Here we go. We got beasts. Daniel 7 is about beasts. You've got the vision of the four beasts, the lion with the wings, the three heads. You've got the beast with the big horns. So he has a dream and sees four beasts. These beasts signify kingdoms. This was the interpretation that was given to him by the angel. But Israel shall possess the kingdom forever. That's also in the interpretation given to him by the angel. This is what's to be expected in the Davidic covenant. So I want to go through this passage, see the context, get to the verses that Jesus quotes, and then hopefully by working through it, we understand how Jesus intended it to be meant and understood in his day. So here's the context leading up. I skipped over the description of the beasts. Instead, we have, now what does Daniel see after the beasts? So, as I watched, thrones were set in place, and as an ancient one took his throne, his clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head was like pure wool, and his throne was fiery flames, and the wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and flowed out from his presence. 1,000 served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood attending to him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were open, and I watched them because of the noise of the arrogant words that the horn was speaking that's on the last beast. As I watched, the beast was put to death, and its body destroyed and given over to be burned with fire. And as for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. Again, apocalyptic language. The angel interprets this for Daniel, and we shouldn't be taking this as horns speaking and all of this. But this is what's leading up to the crux here. And as my vision continued, I saw someone like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient One and was led into his presence. So remember, the Ancient One's up here with 1,000 and the 10,000s and people attending him. And then the Son of Man is approaching the Ancient of Days. He was given authority, honor, sovereignty over the nations of the world. so that people of every race and nation and language would obey him. And his rule is eternal and will never end. His kingdom will never be destroyed. So this sounds, any Christians familiar with their Bible are going to hear Revelation 5, every tribe, tongue, people, and nation. His rule is eternal, it will never end. His kingdom will never be destroyed. Jews would hear 2 Samuel 7 and the Davidic covenant. So that's what we're hearing, messianic imagery here. So now the book of Daniel had to mean something, just like I said about Jesus' statement to the Jews about this generation will not pass away. We need to pause here for a second and say the book of Daniel had to mean something to the Jews of that day. It was written 500 years before Jesus. So we as Christians read it as a Jesus imagery. And as it turns out, the meaning here isn't actually that obscure. It's even interpreted in the passage. The thing that demands an explanation is how Jesus used Daniel 7. We can actually know what the Jewish people thought Daniel 7 meant, and you can even read the rest of Daniel and figure it out. So I want us to work to see the text through ancient eyes. If we recall the context of the book of Daniel, Daniel chapter 2, there's a vision. There's a statue of gold, silver, bronze, and iron that's crushed by a mountain. The interpretation given, and I'm really going over this very quickly, is 4 kingdoms, with the ultimate victory of Yahweh and Israel for eternity over the 4 kingdoms. Daniel chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar goes crazy, and it ends in a proclamation. He says that nobody can stay Yahweh's hand. He is God above all others. Then you have Daniel chapter 5, the writing on the wall. Belshazzar is dead by Yahweh's hand. You've been weighed in the balances and found wanting, and then the king is dead. So once again, Yahweh is victorious. So Daniel 2, Yahweh is victorious. Daniel 4, Yahweh is Lord of all lords. Daniel 5, Yahweh makes a prediction, and the sovereign, the king, is dead. Daniel 6, Daniel's thrown in the lion's den. He's surrounded by, beasts. And Yahweh protects him, and then he ascends out of the den of the lions. He emerges victorious. This is all happening while they're in exile. There's the question, who is going to win? Is it going to be the kingdoms? Is it going to be Yahweh? Has Yahweh abandoned his people? And over we have the victory of God. So Daniel chapter 7 then, the 4 beasts, but the human, not the beasts, inherits the eternal kingdom. This is even interesting. It almost has like a Genesis 2 ring to it, right? The human over the creatures. We are seeing over and over again the victory of God over the nations as being the theme that's highlighted. So I want us to actually listen here then, in the light of the context of Daniel, 3.5 minutes, to a Jewish understanding of this passage. So let's listen to this and see what they have to say about who the Son of Man was, because Jesus, after all, was a Jew, as was his audience. And this had to have an interpretation before he spoke it. That interpretation was probably the one that he was drawing on for this image. So let's go ahead and listen, and then we'll comment on it.
So again, Daniel's telling you here, I didn't understand the vision. You see, the Christians are very able to understand it. Right? They're much smarter than Daniel. Daniel didn't understand it. So Daniel appeals to the angel, please explain it to me. And he says, that's what happened. The angel came and explained it to me, so I should understand what it means. And the angel said, these immense beasts that came up earlier in the passage, which are 4 kingdoms will arise from the earth. So here, the angel tells him, don't wonder about what those 4 beasts were. Those 4 beasts are 4 kingdoms. But the holy, supreme ones will receive the kingship, and they will inherit the kingship forever, forever, and ever. Very interesting. What the angel is telling him is that this one like a man is not a person. It's a people. The angel tells him here, who is going to be the one to inherit everlasting dominion and kingship? It's going to be the holy, supreme ones. The holy, supreme ones. Hold on to your hats for a few moments. It'll become clearer.
Or yarmulkes.
But they are the ones, not the one. They are the ones that will receive kingship and they will inherit. They will inherit the kingship forever, forever, and ever. If you go to verse 22, you'll see the angel clarifies this. The one of ancient days, by the way, in this passage, ancient of days, Atik Yomin, is a reference to God himself. So the one like a man approaches God in this vision. And in verse 22, the one of ancient days came, and again, the holy, supreme ones were granted justice. And the time came, and the holy ones inherited the kingship. And now to make it totally clear, just jump down to verse 27. And the kingship, the dominion, and the grandeur of the kingdoms under all the heavens will be given to the holy, supreme nation. Its kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all rulers will serve and obey it. Now, who in the Bible is described as a holy nation? We know that if you go back to the book of Exodus, chapter 19, verse 6, Israel, the people of Israel, are described as a goy kadosh, a holy nation. And so what's taking place in this chapter of Daniel is this incredible mystical vision of 4 kingships, 4 kingdoms that will subjugate Israel. But ultimately what Daniel is told is that the holy nation will ultimately prevail over all of them, and they, at the end of history, will be given dominion and honor and kingship and glory, etc. So the one like a man, again, is not a person, it's a people.
All right. So I think we'll stop it there. So isn't that interesting? Like here we have the understanding. We know what it was. That the one like a son of man was representing Israel. Now he's going to go on a bit and talk about the messianic implications of it, because I would say that yes, it represented the people of Israel, but the Messiah also represents the people of Israel. It can be singular. But we should be focusing on what's happening there. The people of Israel are being vindicated. The Son of Man is being brought up to God, not being sent down. And it's the exaltations being brought out of the lion's den, if you will. And this is we're going to get there. We're going to get to why this matters, but it's a pretty convoluted trail. So, the coming of the Son of Man, then, if we, going back to culminate all of this, is good first century metaphorical language for 2 things: the defeat of the enemies of the true people of God, and the vindication of the true people themselves. This is what Jesus is saying when he's invoking Daniel 7. So, when is the temple going to be destroyed? Well, a bunch of these things are going to happen. And there's going to be the abomination of desolation, and then you should need to run. And then the true people of God are going to be vindicated, and the defeat of the enemies of the people of God will happen. What? That's so weird. What's he saying? So, going to yet another Tom Wright quote to try and pull this together, therefore seems to me perfectly justifiable to read Daniel 7 in light of the first half of the book. It is suggested that a Jew in the Second Temple period would have read it like that too. Faced with pagan persecution, such a Jew would be encouraged to remain faithful while awaiting the great day of victory and vindication, when Israel would be exalted and her enemies defeated, when the covenant God would show himself to be the God of all the earth and would set up the kingdom which would never be destroyed. So this is a messianic reference. So if we go back and look here, so he approached the Ancient One and was led into his presence. That right there, coming on the clouds of heaven, and what happened when he came on the clouds of heaven? He approached the Ancient One and was led into his presence. Tom Wright jumps in here then and says, when Jesus speaks of the Son of Man coming on the clouds, he is talking not about the second coming, but in line with the Daniel 7 text he's quoting about his vindication after suffering. This is what this has all been building up to. And Tom Wright in the book says, as I've argued elsewhere, and I've been trying to go through the argument elsewhere. But when this is being quoted, according to Tom Wright's interpretation, the Son of Man coming on the clouds is Jesus saying, he's talking about his own vindication after suffering. The coming is an upward, not a downward movement. And in that context, the key texts mean that though Jesus is going to his death, he will be vindicated by events that will take place afterwards. So Jesus is going to be vindicated by the destruction of the temple, because he predicted that's what was going to happen. He's going to be vindicated by his messengers going out into the world, which did happen. And so the end of the age that it's talking about is sort of like the end of the Jewish age. It's the end of the covenant. The day of the Lord, the day of judgment, is coming upon the temple, which represents the day of the Lord, the day of judgment happening upon the Sinai covenant. And then the church are the ones that are going out into the world at that point. Don't try and stand and fight and defend the old ground. The old ground is not useful anymore. The temple is not the point. The temple, we are all temples of the Holy Spirit. That's Pentecost. And this is going to represent then the vindication of Jesus' prophecy when the temple is ultimately destroyed. So if we bring this back, they'll see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with great power and glory. Quoting Daniel 7, the triumph over the nations. He's approaching the Ancient of Days, his ascension. So, resurrection, ascension. He sends out his angels with a loud trumpet call. This is like Isaiah 27. The trumpet gathers all of those lost in the lands of Assyria and Egypt to come and worship Yahweh in his holy mountain. It's the gathering of the people. And referring also to the Great Commission, the sending of his messengers. And they will gather his elect from the four winds from one end of heaven to the other. So the kingdom of God will reign over the whole earth. So that's the idea. This is ultimately saying that through resurrection, ascension, and the destruction of the temple, Jesus is going to be vindicated. The old ways are over, the new ways will be in. So that's the day of judgment on the old. And it's time to go out and gather the elect from the four winds. That's go extend the covenant to the Jews and Gentiles. So his references to Daniel 7 are intended to use the imagery his listeners would have understood to describe how God's plan of redemption for the world through Israel and its Messiah would be accomplished through him. Jesus will be vindicated as a prophet through his resurrection, his ascension, and the destruction of the temple, all of which would occur during their lifetimes. And this will lead to the inclusion of the whole world, Jews and Gentiles, into the covenant. I'm going to say that I find a lot of that compelling, but I'm not sure it's the whole answer. So I get the whole Daniel 7, and I get that it's Israel's representative being vindicated, sitting on the throne forever. I get that the destruction of the temple is probably in view here, given the context of the discussion, and that these things are supposed to be supposed to happen within that age, and so the generation would not pass away. And I also believe that the destruction of the temple is the judgment upon Jerusalem. That said, there are passages that Wright would agree are about the second coming. 1 Thessalonians 4, 1 Corinthians 15, that contain similar language, like the sound of the trumpet. And so it can't only be about that, in my opinion. The language is too parallel. Plus, the trumpet sound is indicative of the day of the Lord. This is Joel chapter 2, this is Zephaniah. And Paul is clear, in the letter of 2 Thessalonians, the day of the Lord has not yet come. So if there is day of the Lord language, the day of the Lord hasn't come. These are things that could also, or in other contexts, are thought of as referring to Jesus' second coming, that there could very well be two levels of meaning operative here, not just one. And in fact, digging into Tom Wright's writings, I bought this book just for the sake of understanding this. I found this passage and thought it was, I wish I would have found it earlier. So this is Tom Wright on Matthew 24 in Matthew for Everyone. This is his popular commentary. So I see no reason why, once we are quite clear about its original meaning, that's of this whole chapter, on the victory of God, we should not then see the chapter as a pointer to other events, to the time we still await when God will complete what he began in the first century and bring the whole created order, as Paul promised in Romans 8, to share the liberty of the glory of God's creation. As we look back to the first century, we should also look on to God's still promised future and thank him that Jesus is already enthroned as Lord of all time and history. In other words, it seems to me, and I'm editorializing, that Tom Wright has tried to really strongly emphasize the victory of God imagery to offer a corrective, essentially, and to not easily give up the ground and yes and it, because he's afraid that people are just missing the point, and he doesn't want to give it up until it really, like, all of the layers of meaning really come through. However, that said, he's willing to see multiple layers of meaning on this one, and I think you have to. I think you do have to look at this as a second coming text, but to solve some of the riddles in the passage, like how does this happen before the generation passes away, you have to know the full context, and you have to understand the victory of God imagery and the vindication of Jesus as a prophet. So, in conclusion, to read Matthew 24 as a passage about how Jesus will return on a cloud is both grammatically incorrect and misses the point. Again, the Son of Man is ascending to the Ancient of Days in Daniel chapter 7. It's not that it's untrue, it's just not what this passage is about. As we saw that in 1 Thessalonians 4. One could argue here that the multiple layers of meaning, maybe it's supposed to be both. I don't necessarily buy that, though. So the Son of Man goes up in Daniel 7, just like Jesus during his ascension, a symbol of triumph over the beasts, over the nations, over the powers. This is his vindication. When he approaches, that's ascension. The reference to this generation then not passing away is best understood as resurrection, ascension, then the destruction of the temple. This is the judgment of God upon Israel, essentially. However, the day of the Lord has not yet come. There is eschatological foreshadowing here, but the day of the Lord is apocalyptic. It's not literal imagery, and we're going to have to talk about that more in the final judgment week next time. So there you have it, with this rather convoluted set of trying to parse out what Tom Wright's argument was in Surprised by Hope. And I don't know if I did it full justice, but I think I've brought a lot of the ideas in. There's a lot going on here. I think it can be read as a second coming passage, but if you read it only as a second coming passage, you start to have a lot of strained exegesis, and you miss some of the points and some of the other references, such as to the destruction of the temple, Jesus' vindication, his victory over the nations, which, absent the ancient view and the ancient understanding of Daniel 7, you're not going to get that. You're just going to see it as, and then eventually I will come back. But that's not, if that's what's being said, that's secondary. Jesus has a different point, and it's about his own vindication amidst all of this, and then what's going to happen to the temple and what that means for the covenant going forward. So there's so much more going on here than some kind of parousia as the only thing operative. So, and I hope that came out, and I hope you watch the final video. I really implore you to watch the final video on why it matters to get the second coming right. Why does this victory language matter more than snatching language? So please watch that. Please subscribe to the channel. I really appreciate it. God bless.